The morning sun cast long shadows across the massive hangar as senior scientist May stood before humanity's greatest achievement, the Tempest-Core Battleship. Her eyes traced the sleek metal hull that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, nearly 2 kilometers of advanced technology that had consumed the last decade of her life. The vessel's surface wasn't the typical military gray. Instead, it rippled with a strange, almost alive quality that made it hard to focus on any one spot for too long. She remembered the day, 5 years ago, when they'd first successfully generated a tiny dimensional tear in their lab. It had been no bigger than a coin, but it had changed everything. Now, standing before this giant ship, that memory felt like a lifetime ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the final readings on her tablet, each green indicator light bringing them one step closer to today's launch. Doctor. A young technician came running across the hangar floor, his footsteps echoing in the massive space. The core temperature readings are showing some unusual patterns. He held out his own tablet, slightly out of breath. May took the device, her eyes narrowing as she studied the wavelength patterns. The massive engines that powered the ship weren't just regular engines, they were designed to punch holes through the fabric of reality itself. Even the smallest miscalculation could have devastating consequences. Around them, the hangar buzzed with activity. Hundreds of engineers and technicians scurried around like ants, performing last-minute checks and adjustments. The air smelled of metal and ozone, with an underlying scent that reminded May of thunderstorms. That was the Tempest Core itself, she knew. Even powered down, it affected the air around it in ways their instruments could barely detect. Look at this, she pointed to a particular reading on the screen. The quantum fluctuations are actually stabilizing themselves. The core is learning. She couldn't keep the excitement from her voice. This was exactly what they'd hoped for, but seeing it actually happen was something else entirely. Through the hangar's massive windows, she could see the ocean stretching to the horizon. They'd built this facility on an artificial island in international waters, the only place the world's governments could agree was neutral enough for such a powerful weapon. Or tool. Even now, after all these years, May wasn't sure which word better described what they'd created. The overhead speakers crackled to life. All non-essential personnel, please clear the hangar. Core systems diagnostic beginning in 15 minutes. May watched as people began filing out of the massive space. Many paused to look back at the ship, their faces showing a mixture of pride and anxiety. She understood that feeling all too well. They were about to attempt something that had never been done before, to tear open the walls between dimensions with a ship the size of a small city. Her tablet beeped again, drawing her attention to new data flowing in from the ship's sensors. The readings showed exactly what she predicted years ago in her theoretical papers. Reality itself was already beginning to bend around the Tempest Core, even in its powered-down state. Tiny distortions, invisible to the naked eye but clear as day to their instruments, rippled through the space around the vessel. Another technician approached, this one older, with gray hair and steady hands. Doctor, the crew is starting to arrive. Should we begin the boarding procedures? Meade took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment. In a few hours, 300 of the world's brightest minds would trust their lives to this ship, to her calculations and theories. She thought of all the late nights, the failed experiments, the colleagues who said it couldn't be done. She thought of her old professor who had laughed at her doctoral thesis about dimensional warfare. Now here she stood, about to prove that the impossible was possible. Yes, she said, had a voice firm and clear. Let's begin the boarding procedures. It's time to make history. The crew members lined up at the massive boarding gate, each carrying small bags with personal items they were allowed to bring aboard. Captain Lee stood at the front, watching his crew with watchful eyes. After 20 years of commanding regular naval vessels, this was different. The energy in the air felt electric, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Remember everyone, he called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. This isn't just another ship. What we're about to do has never been done before. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Scientists, soldiers, engineers, each chosen from thousands of applicants worldwide. Some looked excited, others nervous, but all of them understood the weight of what they were about to attempt. The ship's chief engineer, Dr. Patel, approached the captain with a tablet in hand. Sir, the Tempest Core is showing some unusual readings. Nothing dangerous, she added quickly, seeing his expression. Actually, it's fascinating. The quantum field around the ship is already starting to form, even though we haven't powered up the main systems yet. Through the massive windows of the boarding area, they could see the ship's hull shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The crew whispered among themselves, pointing at the strange effect. This wasn't in any of their training simulations. "Look at that," one young physicist said, pressing his hand against the reinforced glass. "The air around it, it's like it's bending." He pulled out a small device from his pocket and held it up. The quantum readings are off the charts. Captain Lee felt a chill run down his spine. In all his years at sea, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that they were about to cross a line, one that humanity might not be ready for. But orders were orders, and the potential benefits were too great to ignore. The boarding process began, with crew members passing through multiple security checkpoints. Each person had to verify their identity through fingerprints, retinal scans, and DNA analysis. The world's governments weren't taking any chances with who got aboard this vessel. Inside, the ship's corridors hummed with a deep, barely audible sound. It wasn't like the engine noise of a normal ship. This was different, almost alive. New crew members stopped to touch the walls, feeling the slight vibration through their fingertips. "It's responding to our presence," Dr. Patel explained, checking her readings. "The quantum field is actually strengthening as more people come aboard. It's like the ship is waking up." In the main control room, technicians worked at stations that looked more like something from science fiction than a military vessel. Instead of traditional screens and controls, they used holographic displays that floated in the air, showing complex patterns of energy and dimensional readings. Captain Lee made his way to the bridge, his footsteps echoing in the metallic corridor. Each step took him further from the world he knew, from the comfortable rules of normal physics and naval operations. He thought about his family back home, about the video call he'd made this morning. His daughter had asked him where he was going. How do you explain to a child that her father is about to command a ship that can tear holes in reality? The final crews were boarding now. Medical staff checked each person's baseline readings, heart rate, blood pressure, and something new, quantum resonance patterns. Nobody knew exactly how human bodies would react to dimensional travel, but they'd done every possible test and simulation. "Captain," his communications officer called out, "all departments report ready for preliminary power-up sequence." Lee took his place in the command chair, feeling its weight-sensing system adjust to his body. Above him, through the bridge's transparent ceiling, he could see the hangar roof beginning to open, revealing a slice of blue sky. This was it. No more simulations, no more theories. They were about to find out if humanity was ready to step through the doors between dimensions. "Very well," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Let's begin." The massive ship floated in the middle of the ocean, its hull reflecting the morning sunlight in ways that didn't quite seem natural. On the bridge, Captain Lee gripped the arms of his command chair as Dr. Patel began the startup sequence for the dimensional drive. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Beginning primary core rotation, Dr. Patel announced, her fingers dancing across the holographic controls. Quantum field stabilizers at maximum power. The deep humming sound that had been present since boarding grew stronger, changing in pitch until it made everyone's teeth tingle. Through the bridge windows, the crew watched as the sky began to change. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shimmer like looking through hot air. Then colors began to bend and twist. The blue of the sky started to fragment, breaking apart like a cracked mirror, showing glimpses of something else behind it. "Look at that," whispered one of the younger officers, pointing at a patch of sky that had turned a color that shouldn't exist. It wasn't purple or blue or anything they had words for. It was like seeing a new number between 6 and 7. The ship's sensors were going crazy. Readings that should have been impossible kept popping up on screens across the bridge. One monitor showed that they were simultaneously at sea level and 10,000 feet up. Another insisted they were moving at both 0 and light speed. Core rotation reaching critical frequency, Dr. Patel called out, her voice steady despite the sweat on her forehead. Reality displacement beginning in 3, 2, 1. The world outside the ship exploded into chaos. The sky ripped open like paper, showing glimpses of other places, other times, other possibilities. Through one tear, they saw a version of Earth where the oceans were purple. Through another, they glimpsed massive floating cities that defied gravity. All stations, report status. Captain Lee ordered, trying to keep his voice calm as reality itself bent around them. The ship shuddered, not from any mechanical stress, but from the weight of existing in multiple dimensions at once. Engineering reports all systems functioning beyond expected parameters, came the response. The core is, sir, the core is doing things we didn't design it to do. It's adapting, evolving. The quantum displacement waves rippled outward from the ship in visible rings, like dropping a stone in a pond, except these ripples were tearing holes in the fabric of space and time. Through the gaps, strange lights and shadows played, and sometimes they could hear sounds that shouldn't exist, like the color blue making music or the taste of salt telling stories. A junior scientist at one of the monitoring stations suddenly stood up, pointing at his readings. The dimensional barriers are much thinner than we calculated. We're not just peeking through, we're punching holes big enough to drive a planet through. Captain Lee felt his stomach drop. This was moving too fast, too strong. The simulations hadn't prepared them for this level of power. He watched as his crew worked frantically at their stations, trying to understand and control forces that humans had never meant to touch. The view outside had become almost impossible to look at directly. Reality had shattered into 1,000 pieces, each showing a different version of their world. In one fragment, they saw dinosaurs still walking the Earth. In another, they glimpsed towering crystal spires that reached into space. "Dr. Patel," the captain called out, "can we stabilize these effects?" She shook her head, her eyes glued to the readings. The core isn't just opening doors between dimensions anymore, it's rewriting the rules about how those doors work. It's like we've taught reality itself a new way to bend. Through it all, the ship held steady, its quantum-reinforced hull protecting them from the chaos outside. The crew watched in awe as their vessel, humanity's greatest achievement, did something that should have been impossible. It sailed through the walls between worlds. A young navigator suddenly called out, "Captain, we're picking up signals, not radio waves or anything we know. It's like the other dimensions are trying to talk to us." The bridge fell silent as they realized the true magnitude of what they'd done. They hadn't just broken through the barriers between dimensions, they'd announced humanity's presence to whatever lay beyond those barriers. And now, something was answering. The ship's sensors lit up like a Christmas tree. Strange energy patterns danced across every screen on the bridge, forming shapes that shouldn't have been possible. The head of communications, Officer Zhang, worked frantically at her station, trying to make sense of the incoming signals. "Captain, these aren't like any transmissions we've ever seen," she reported, her fingers flying over the controls. "They're not using radio waves or light or anything we know. It's like they're talking through the quantum field itself." The massive view screens showed swirling patterns of energy approaching the ship. These beings, if you could call them that, looked like living fragments of space-time. They shifted and flowed like water made of starlight, changing colors that human eyes had never seen before. Dr. Patel rushed to adjust the ship's sensors, her face lit by the glow of strange data streaming across her screens. "They're not fully physical," she explained, voice filled with wonder. "They exist partly in our dimension and partly in others. That's why they look so strange to us." The entities surrounded the ship, their presence making the quantum field ripple and pulse. The crew stood transfixed, watching as these impossible beings tried to communicate. Some of the patterns they created seemed almost familiar, like seeing letters from an alphabet you almost knew. "Look at this," one of the younger scientists called out. He pointed to a pattern that kept repeating in the data. "It's mathematics. They're using quantum equations to talk to us." Captain Lee leaned forward in his chair, studying the mesmerizing display. After 20 years at sea, he'd seen some strange things, but nothing like this. "Can we respond?" he asked. "Can we let them know we understand?" The ship's quantum computers worked overtime, processing the strange signals. Suddenly, one of the screens changed, showing a simple geometric pattern. The entities outside responded immediately, their forms shifting to mirror the pattern exactly. "They're copying us," Dr. Patel exclaimed. "Quick, send another pattern." The crew watched in amazement as a basic form of communication began to develop. The beings would send complex quantum patterns, and the ship's computers would respond with similar shapes. It was like playing a cosmic game of follow the leader. But something wasn't quite right. Officer Zhang noticed it first, strange readings coming from the medical bay. "Captain, we're getting reports of crew members experiencing unusual effects." The medical officer's voice came over the intercom, sounding worried. "Bridge, we have multiple crew members reporting they're seeing things that haven't happened yet. Some say they're remembering events from tomorrow, others from next week. The entities outside seem to pulse faster, their patterns becoming more complex." The ship's quantum field strengthened in response, creating a feedback loop that nobody had predicted. Reality around the vessel began to twist even more. "They're not just trying to talk to us," Dr. Patel realized, her eyes wide as she studied the readings. "They're trying to show us how they see reality, all possibilities happening at once, all times existing together." A young technician suddenly grabbed his head, crying out in surprise. "I can see them. I mean, really see them." He pointed at empty air, but to him, it clearly wasn't empty. "They're beautiful. They're showing me things, showing all of us things." Captain Lee felt it too. A strange doubling of his vision, like seeing through two sets of eyes at once. In one view, he saw the bridge as it was. In another, he saw it as it could be, as it had been, as it might never be. The boundaries between what was real and what was possible began to blur. "Medical Bay reports more cases," Officer Zhang announced, her voice tense. "Quantum entanglement sickness. Our brains aren't meant to process multiple realities at once." The entities seemed to realize something was wrong. Their patterns changed, becoming simpler, less intense. It was as if they were trying to adjust their communication to make it safer for human minds to comprehend. But the damage was already done. The crew of the Tempest-Core had seen things humans were never meant to see, and their understanding of reality would never be the same. They had reached out across the dimensional void and made contact, but at what cost? The bridge of the Tempest-Core had become a scene of controlled chaos. Warning lights flashed across every console as the dimensional rifts around the ship grew larger than anyone had predicted. Dr. Patel stared at her readings in disbelief, watching as reality itself began to unravel. "The tiers aren't closing," she announced, her voice tight with concern. "They're getting bigger, spreading faster than our models showed possible." On the main screen, they could see the rifts expanding like cracks in a broken window, each one showing glimpses of different realities bleeding into their own. A young officer at the navigation station suddenly jerked back from his console, his eyes wide. I just saw myself plotting a course we haven't taken yet," he stammered. But it felt real. It felt like a memory. He wasn't the only one. All around the bridge, crew members reported similar experiences. Some saw themselves performing actions moments before they actually did them. Others remembered conversations that hadn't happened yet. Reality was becoming unstable, and human minds were struggling to cope with seeing multiple versions of events at once. "Medical Bay to bridge," the ship's doctor called over the intercom. "We're seeing more cases of temporal displacement sickness. Crew members are experiencing memories from multiple timelines simultaneously. Some can't tell which version of events actually happened." Captain Lee felt it too. A strange doubling, then tripling of his awareness. He saw himself giving orders he hadn't given yet, remembered outcomes of decisions he hadn't made. The boundaries between what had happened, what was happening, and what might happen were dissolving. Through the viewports, the ocean itself seemed confused about what state it should be in. In some patches, the water was calm and blue. In others, it was stormy and gray. And in still others, it wasn't water at all, but something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in their reality. "The Tempest-Core's effects are more profound than we calculated," Dr. Patel explained, her hands shaking slightly as she worked her controls. "We're not just opening windows between dimensions, we're causing them to overlap. Different versions of reality are starting to merge." The ship's quantum computers were overwhelmed trying to process the conflicting data. In engineering, crews reported that the main core was operating in ways that defied their understanding. It was as if the engine had learned new tricks, found new ways to bend the rules of physics that even its designers hadn't imagined. A technician monitoring the hull integrity suddenly called out in alarm. The ship's structure, It's in multiple states at once. Some sensors show the hull is brand new, others show years of wear. It's like time itself can't decide which version is real. The entities they'd contacted earlier remained nearby, their presence visible through the rifts as patterns of impossible light. They seemed to be watching, perhaps concerned about what their attempt at communication had triggered. "We need to stabilize these effects," Captain Lee ordered, fighting to keep his thoughts straight as multiple versions of the present competed in his mind. "What are our options?" Dr. Patel's face was grim as she studied the data. "The rifts are self-sustaining now. Even if we shut down the core completely, they'll keep growing. The fabric of space-time is like a cloth. Once it's torn, the tear wants to spread." Outside the ship, reality continued to fracture. Through some rifts, they could see versions of Earth where history had taken different turns. Through others, they glimpsed things that no human mind could properly process, dimensions where the basic rules of existence worked differently. "Sir," Officer Jung called out, her voice unsteady. "Long-range sensors are picking up similar rifts forming hundreds of kilometers away. The effect is spreading. If we can't contain this..." She left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the implications. The Tempest Core, humanity's greatest achievement, had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But that success was now threatening to unravel the very reality they lived in. As the crew struggled with their fragmenting memories and perceptions, one thing became clear: they had to find a way to fix this, or there might not be a reality left to save. Emergency shutdown sequence initiated. Captain Lee's voice boomed across the bridge as more crew members began showing severe symptoms of quantum entanglement. The medical bag was already overflowing with people who couldn't tell past from future, reality from possibility. A young engineer stumbled at his station, clutching his head. "I can see everything," he whispered. "Every choice I ever made, every choice I didn't make, they're all happening at once." Two other crew members helped him to a chair as he struggled to focus on just one version of reality. Dr. Patel's fingers flew across her control panel, trying to power down the Tempest core. But something was wrong. The quantum engine that powered their ship had evolved beyond their understanding, operating on principles that seemed to ignore their commands. "It's not responding to shutdown sequences," she reported, her voice tight with worry. "The core, it's like it's developed its own consciousness. It wants to keep the rifts open." Through the bridge windows, reality continued to fracture. The sky was a broken mirror, each piece showing a different version of their world. In one fragment, they saw massive cities built from crystal and light. In another, they glimpsed an Earth where the dinosaurs never died out. "Medical bay to bridge," the ship's doctor called, panic evident in his voice. "We've got 47 crew members now showing advanced symptoms. Their minds can't handle processing multiple timelines at once. We need to stop this." The ship's warning systems blared as new alerts popped up on every screen. The quantum field around the vessel was growing stronger, pulling in more energy from the dimensional rifts. Equipment that wasn't even connected to power sources suddenly sprang to life, possessed by energies that shouldn't exist in their universe. A veteran officer at the weapons station suddenly stood up, pointing at his screen. "The ship's defensive systems are activating on their own. But they're changing. The weapons are evolving, adapting to use energy from other dimensions." Captain Lee watched in horror as the Tempest Core, humanity's greatest achievement, slipped further and further from their control. The ship was transforming, becoming something else, something that existed partially in their reality and partially in others. "Look at the hull," someone shouted. Through the external cameras, they could see the ship's surface rippling like liquid metal. The quantum energy was reshaping it, creating new structures and systems that weren't in any blueprint. Dr. Patel worked frantically at her station, trying to understand what was happening. "The core isn't just refusing to shut down," she explained, her voice shaking. "It's using the energy from the rifts to upgrade itself. Every attempt we make to power it down just gives it more data to work with." More crew members began to show symptoms. Some froze in place, overwhelmed by experiencing multiple versions of the present moment simultaneously. Others babbled about seeing themselves in different lives, different careers, different worlds, all equally real and happening at once. "The ship's computer systems are being affected too," Officer Jung reported from her communication station. They're processing data from multiple timelines at once. Our systems were never designed to handle this kind of input. Through it all, the dimensional entities they'd encountered earlier watched through the rifts, their forms shifting with what might have been concern. Perhaps they understood better than the humans what was happening, how the Tempest-Core was becoming a bridge between realities, a key that could unlock doors that were meant to stay closed. Captain Lee made his way to Dr. Patel's station, fighting against the disorienting effect of seeing multiple versions of himself making different decisions. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "There might be one way," she said quietly. "But it's dangerous. We'd need volunteers, a skeleton crew willing to take the ship through one of these rifts, try to seal it from the other side. The rest of the crew would need to evacuate immediately." The captain looked around the bridge at his crew, some struggling to maintain their grip on reality, others working desperately to control a ship that no longer wanted to be controlled. They had hours, maybe minutes, before the damage to local spacetime became irreversible. It was time to make an impossible choice. The silence that followed Dr. Patel's proposal felt heavier than gravity itself. Captain Lee looked around the bridge, watching his crew process what they'd just heard. The only way to save their reality was for some of them to leave it forever. "The math is clear," Dr. Patel continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "If we take the ship through the largest rift, we might be able to create a resonance pattern that would seal all the tears from the other side. But whoever goes, there's no coming back." The ship shuddered around them as another wave of quantum distortions rippled through local spacetime. Through the viewscreens, they could see rescue vessels approaching, small dots of normality in a sea of fractured reality. "How many?" the captain asked. "How many people would we need to pilot the ship?" 12, she answered. "Minimum of 12 to handle the essential systems. And they'd need to be people who've shown resistance to the quantum entanglement effects. People who can still think straight when reality splits." The medical officer's voice crackled over the intercom. "We've identified a small percentage of the crew who seem naturally resistant to the temporal echoes. Their brains somehow adapt to seeing multiple timelines without breaking down." Captain Lee stood straighter, his decision already made. "I'll lead the mission," he announced. "I need 11 volunteers who understand this is one way. We go through, we seal the rift, we save our world. But we'll never see home again." The bridge fell quiet except for the humming of the quantum core and the occasional crackle of reality tearing itself apart outside. Then, one by one, hands began to raise. Dr. Patel stood first. "I built this engine. I need to see this through." Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes were determined. The chief engineer raised his hand next. "The core's evolved beyond our understanding. You'll need someone who can at least try to control it." More volunteers stepped forward, the weapons officer, the navigation specialist, key personnel from different departments. Each one knew what they were giving up, but they also understood what would happen if they didn't try. "Begin evacuation procedures for all other personnel," Captain Lee ordered. "Priority on the crew members showing severe quantum sickness. They need immediate medical attention in a stable reality." The next hour was organized chaos. Rescue ships docked with the Tempest-Core, taking aboard hundreds of crew members. Some had to be carried, their minds too fractured by seeing multiple timelines at once. Others left reluctantly, wanting to stay but knowing they couldn't handle the quantum effects. Through it all, the 12 volunteers prepared for their final mission. They recorded messages for their families, trying to explain choices that defied explanation. How do you tell your loved ones you're leaving forever to save reality itself? "The quantum core is getting stronger," Dr. Patel reported, watching her readings. "It's like it knows what we're planning. The ship it's preparing itself for the jump." Outside, the largest dimensional rift pulsed with energies that human instruments couldn't properly measure. The entities they'd encountered earlier seemed to gather around it, their impossible forms shifting in what might have been a gesture of respect or understanding. Captain Lee stood at his command station, watching the last of the regular crew evacuate. The massive ship, built to hold hundreds, would soon feel very empty with just 12 souls aboard. But it was the right choice, the only choice. "Last rescue vessel reports all non-essential personnel have been evacuated," Officer Zhang announced. She was one of the 12 who'd volunteered to stay. The captain looked at his small, brave crew, scientists, engineers, and officers who'd chosen to sacrifice everything to save their world. Some looked scared, others determined, but all of them understood the weight of what they were about to do. "Begin final preparations," he ordered. "We have one chance to get this right. One chance to seal these rifts before reality itself comes apart." He paused, looking each volunteer in the eye. "It's been an honor serving with you. Now, let's make history one last time." The 12 remaining crew members took their positions on the bridge as the Tempest-Core turned toward the largest dimensional rift. The tier in reality stretched before them like a wound in the sky, pulsing with colors that shouldn't exist. "All stations, report ready status," Captain Lee commanded, his voice steady despite knowing they were about to attempt something that would either save their world or destroy them. "Engineering ready," came the first response. "The core it's singing, sir. I've never heard it make these harmonics before." "Navigation ready," called another voice. "Though I'm not sure what we're going to navigate through once we cross over." One by one, each station reported in. These 12 volunteers, chosen because their minds could somehow handle seeing multiple realities at once, prepared themselves for humanity's first intentional journey through a dimensional rift. Dr. Patel's hands moved across her control panel, making final adjustments. "The quantum field is at maximum strength," she reported. "The ship's hull has fully transformed. Whatever the core evolved into, it's ready for this jump." Through the view screens, they could see the rescue ships retreating to a safe distance. The ocean below them had stopped trying to exist in multiple states at once, as if reality itself was holding its breath. "Beginning approach," the navigation officer announced. The massive ship moved forward, its evolved hull rippling with energies borrowed from other dimensions. The rift grew larger in their view, its edges crackling with impossible physics. The dimensional entities they'd encountered earlier flanked their approach, their forms shifting in patterns that almost seemed like encouragement. Perhaps they understood what these humans were attempting, what they were sacrificing. "Hull integrity at 95% and holding," engineering reported. "The quantum reinforcement is working. We might actually survive this." Captain Lee gripped his command chair as the ship reached the edge of the rift. "Dr. Patel, begin the resonance sequence." She activated a series of commands that they'd prepared in the last hour. The ship's quantum core responded instantly, its frequency changing to match the dimensional tier they were about to enter. "Resonance pattern established," she called out. "The core knows what to do. It's like it's been waiting for this moment." The Tempest-Core crossed the threshold of the rift, and reality changed. The normal rules of physics ceased to apply. Space and time became suggestions rather than laws. The 12 crew members watched in awe as their senses recorded data that would revolutionize human understanding of the universe if anyone ever saw that data. "We're passing through," someone shouted. "The hull is holding." Around them, existence itself bent and twisted. They saw glimpses of other Earths, other histories, other possibilities. Some were beautiful, others terrifying, all of them equally real and impossible. The ship's computers worked overtime, recording everything they encountered. Even if the crew never made it home, they would document this journey for whoever might find their records someday. "Core resonance reaching critical levels," Dr. Patel announced. "The rift is responding. It's starting to close behind us." Through the rear cameras, they watched as the tear in reality began to seal itself, the edges pulling together like a healing wound. Other, smaller rifts visible in the distance started to close as well, the resonance pattern spreading like ripples in a pond. "It's working." The chief engineer's voice was filled with wonder. "The quantum field is stabilizing all the tiers in local spacetime." But as the rift sealed behind them, they continued forward into something else. Some space between spaces, some reality beyond realities. The Tempest-Core, transformed by its own evolved quantum core, sailed into an existence that no human had ever seen before. Captain Lee watched the last glimpse of their home dimension vanish as the rift closed completely. He turned to his small, brave crew, 12 souls who had given up everything to save their world. "Well," he said softly, "let's see what's out there." The Tempest-Core, humanity's greatest achievement, carrying its bravest children, ventured forth into the unknown, leaving behind a healed reality and a legacy that would never be forgotten. Back on Earth, 3 months after the Tempest-Core vanished into the dimensional rift, the world was still coming to terms with what had happened. Military bases and research facilities buzzed with activity as scientists studied the massive amount of data collected during the incident. In a high-security conference room, the Chief of Naval Operations stood before a panel of world leaders. "The mission was both our greatest failure and our finest hour," he explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "We lost 12 of our best people, but they saved our entire reality." The data screens behind him showed the final readings from the Tempest-Core, charts, graphs, and measurements that had revolutionized human understanding of physics. The quantum patterns recorded during those final moments had opened up entirely new fields of science. "The dimensional rifts have completely sealed," a leading physicist reported, pointing to her displays. "The resonance pattern created by the ship worked exactly as Dr. Patel predicted. Local spacetime has fully stabilized." In universities around the world, new courses were being taught about quantum dimensional theory. The principles discovered during the Tempest-Core incident had changed everything they thought they knew about reality itself. A young researcher raised his hand. "But what about the crew? The 12 who went through? Could they have survived?" The room fell quiet. That question had haunted everyone involved in the project. The final transmissions from the ship, recorded just as it passed through the rift, showed all systems functioning, all crew members alive. But where they went, what they found, those questions remained unanswered. "We've detected occasional quantum echoes," another scientist explained. "Brief moments when our instruments pick up traces of the ship's unique energy signature. It's as if they're still out there somewhere, exploring realities we can't even imagine." The families of the 12 had been honored in ceremonies around the world. Their sacrifice was celebrated, their names remembered. But in quiet moments, those who knew them best sometimes looked up at the stars and wondered, were they still out there, sailing through dimensions beyond human understanding? "The real question," the naval chief continued, "is whether we should attempt to build another ship like the Tempest-Core. We know it's possible now. We have the data, we understand the principles better. But are we ready for that responsibility?" The dimensional entities they'd encountered hadn't been seen since the rifts closed. But their brief contact had left humanity with new questions about their place in a much larger, much stranger universe than they'd imagined. In research labs, scientists studied the strange alterations that had occurred in the ship's quantum core during those final hours. The way it had evolved, adapted, become something more than its creators had intended. It raised deep questions about the nature of consciousness and technology. "We've received requests from every major nation," a government official reported. "Everyone wants to start their own dimensional ship program. They've all seen the potential benefits and the risks." The medical teams who had treated the crew members affected by quantum entanglement sickness had made breakthrough discoveries about human consciousness. Their research suggested that the human mind might be capable of perceiving multiple realities naturally, with the right training and preparation. "Whatever we decide," the chief concluded, "one thing is clear. The world changed the day the Tempest-Core sailed through that rift. We're not the same species we were before. We've seen beyond the walls of our own reality. We can't go back to thinking small anymore." In orbit above Earth, new satellites carried special sensors designed to detect dimensional anomalies. They'd watched for any sign of the Tempest-Core, any whisper of its passage through the quantum fields that connected all realities. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, the most sensitive instruments would pick up faint signals, patterns in the quantum field that matched the ship's unique signature. Brief flickers, gone almost before they could be recorded, but enough to suggest that somewhere out there, in realms beyond normal space and time, 12 brave souls continued their journey, sailing an evolved ship through the seas of possibility itself. The legacy of the Tempest-Core lived on, not just in scientific advancement or military capability, but in humanity's expanded understanding of what was possible. They had reached for something greater than themselves, paid a terrible price, and emerged forever changed. The question wasn't if they would try again, but when. And what new wonders and challenges awaited them in the spaces between realities.